All right.
Let me make sure I have everything. Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. We have a lot of folks in here. I see the numbers are continuing to grow. My name is Jasmyne Cannick, and I am the political vice president for LAAAWPAC. LAAAWPAC stands for the Los Angeles African American Women's Political Action Committee. This year, LAAAWPAC is celebrating its 30th anniversary as being the first political action committee in California to focus on issues important to Black women and Black people. Today, under the leadership of our president, Ingrid Palmer, and our executive board, LAAAWPAC is a leading political action committee for the identification and support of progressive candidates, progressive ballot initiatives, and political issues leading to positive socioeconomic and political change for the Black community through the power of people and money. Because you want to make some change in California politics, you got to support your candidates with money, you got to support the ballot measures with money, and that is what this political action committee has been doing for over 30 years, and I'm so proud to be a part of the organization. You can learn more about LAAAWPAC, including joining LAAAWPAC, by visiting laapac.org, LAAAWPAC.org. We're also on social media as LAAAWPAC, so you can look us up on social media as well, or talk to one of our board members. They love to talk about LAAAWPAC and get folks signed up. In addition to being a political action committee, LAAAWPAC hosts a variety of forums and discussions aimed at not only educating voters on the issues, but bringing candidates and elected officials to us, the community, for a deep dive conversation on those issues. Tonight is no different, and I am pleased to welcome Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascón to LAAAWPAC. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Jasmine. So good to see you.
Thank you. George Gascón is the former district attorney for the city and county of San Francisco and former assistant chief of the Los Angeles Police Department. In 2020, he ran against then district attorney Jackie Lacey in an effort to modernize LA's criminal justice system. Since beating Jackie Lacey by more than 250,000 votes, he's faced tremendous criticism and backlash for enacting the criminal justice reform policies that he ran on and that actually got him elected. In addition, he's faced lawsuits from his own prosecutors, interference on his cases from other law enforcement officials, and there's been an outcry from crime victims who claim that his policies have abandoned them. So the questions tonight that we're gonna dive into are, is all of this misguided outrage from reform-resistant law enforcement officials or conservative politicians? How do Black voters factor into the equation, being both victims of crime as well as victims of mass incarceration? Is there a way to achieve the criminal justice reform policies that are being asked for, but also to preserve public safety? As we speak, there's already a petition seeking to recall George Gascón circulating with the hopes of triggering a recall election. So we're going to talk about all of that for the time that we have George Gascón here. I want to ask you that if you have any questions for the DA, please drop them into the Q&A. Do not drop them into the chat. Drop them into the Q&A, because that's what I'm looking at, and I'll be able to pull your question from there. If you want your name attributed to your question and your city or neighborhood, please add that along with your question. Okay, DA Gascón. So first question is, are you regretting that you ran for the job?
No, not at all. I'm actually tremendously energized. I knew that this was going to be a fight. We're taking on a 40 years plus of tradition of mass incarceration and a system that, has been involved in systemic racism since the origins of this country, right? I mean, I think that it's hard to talk about reimagining the criminal justice system without understanding that our legal criminal system started by being embedded in the institutional racism in this country. And that after the Civil War, the evolution of the criminal legal system was one to criminalize behavior in order to take people that formerly were slaves legally, and now since slavery had been outlawed, then to create slave-like conditions And that's how the Jim Crow era, sort of evolved. And, I know I'm moving very fast, but, then we get into, the 1900s, and we get into the late 1900s, and we get into the whole war on drugs, quote unquote, war on our people. And again, then the sort of the prison industrial complex was created, which was purely driven by money and political power. And what I'm doing with others around the country is that we're fighting back, right? We're pushing back on that narrative that in order to have safe communities, you have to mass incarcerate Black and brown people. And to the contrary, my argument is actually that because we have mass incarcerated our community, we are paying the dividends of that very mistaken policy. And people are, I think it's a couple of things that I want to bring up. The people that are pushing for recall, they talk about mind not caring about victims, but when you really peel the onion, what it is about, they're really concerned about punishment. They're really concerned about incarceration. They're not necessarily concerned about the victims. And to that end, they like to pick and choose the statistics that they want to use. They don't tell you, for instance, in LA County, pre-2020, and I'm going to put 2020 aside for a second. I'll address 2020 in a moment. But COVID created a whole new host of issues for us. But if you look at the prior DA's administration, you go back all the way to 2012, and you go to 2019, and our violent crime during that period of time went up by 25%. At the same time that we were incarcerating people at rates higher than 57 other counties of the 56 other counties of the 58 counties in the state. And that really, you have to sit for a moment and think, and I'm not talking about raw numbers, I'm talking about proportionality. We're being compared with counties in the Central Valley, Riverside, San Marino, places that is not a good comparison. And we outdid ourselves, and still violent crime went up. And then, of course, 2020 comes in, and now then crime, starts to really go up under the same policies of mass incarceration. That was before I got elected. And yet now in 2021, after I get elected, there's immediately like this thing that somehow my policies are creating this, and it's extremely disingenuous. But this is what my policies are doing. We are beginning to look at violent crime through a public health lens. So we eliminated, for instance, our hardcore gang unit, which was a throwback from the 80s, where we rewarded lawyers for trying a lot of cases and seeking very, very punitive sentencing, which, by the way, almost always put a Black or a brown person in prison for very long periods of time. Many times took children and put them into adult prisons. And I took that, and we moved away from that, and we created a thing called COVER, which we call Community Violence Reduction, where we have prosecutors and we have police, but we're also bringing county public health, and we're bringing social workers, and we're bringing community organizations, and we're bringing community violence interrupters, and bringing all these people to the fold. And rather than just looking at arrest and prosecution, we're looking at prevention, we're looking at intervention, we're looking at seeking to address some of the root causes of particular disputes at the neighborhood level and stopping the violence before it occurs. Understanding that sometimes there will be an arrest in the prosecution. But even when we do so, rather than seeking to send somebody to prison for 80, 100 years, life without the possibility of parole, actually understanding the science says that even in the most violent cases, usually early incapacitation or prison may serve the purpose of protecting us. But there comes a point for every year of prison, you increase the likelihood of recidivism upon release by 4 or 7%. And that's why we have so many problems in our community, not to mention the inequalities that gotten us to where we are today. So it's a whole lot to unpack. I want to say just in conclusion here before we move, because I got a lot of other questions. When you really peel the onion here, as we have, and you look at the people that are supporting this, we have, mega Republican Trump donors. We got a guy named Jeff Palmer, who is a LA real estate mogul, a developer, who just last year gave $2 million to Donald Trump, and who's being sued for trying to get around the laws of affordable housing. We have a guy like Dennis Zine, who is a former director of the Los Angeles Police Protective League, former council member of the LA of the Valley area, a very strong Republican. We have Steve Cooley, who wants to run for DA again, by the way, a very strong Republican that is still very angry when I supported Kamala Harris to become Attorney General, now, our vice president. So it's when you peel the onion and you look behind it that, yeah, you have a few victims on the front that some of them are people of color, by the way, black and brown, that are very angry and they want retribution. But when you look at the polls and you look at, what the majority of the victims are saying in the county, it's contrary to what they're saying. And they don't like to talk about, for instance, the fact that we created a Victims Advisory Board, where we brought victims of violence, both police violence and community violence, most of them men and women of color. They don't like to talk about this stuff, right? They just want to focus on that. Well, he doesn't care about victims, which is so far from the truth.
I appreciate all of that. And I'm really happy that in your answer, you did mention that, yeah, there are some people of color who are sort of at the forefront of this, because as I said in my introduction, as people of color, particularly as Black people, we are both victims of crime as well as victims of the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration. And so I know amongst our membership and amongst just Black people in general, there is this constant conversation around the striking the balance between reforms and public safety. And I'll be honest, I'll use myself. I think when you ran, I told you that, look, not everybody here is an abolitionist. Like, some of us like jails and prisons, and we don't want to get rid of them, right? But, joking aside, I think that, there has been some concern in our community that, we're not going to be prosecuting people for committing heinous crimes. And I think that this discussion is important to make it clear that the DA's office is still in the business of prosecuting people, correct?
Very much so. And we're prosecuting violent crimes. In fact, we're creating more bandwidth to prosecute violence by moving away from prosecuting the houseless and the poor,
right,
for alleged violations that are really tied to your economic status of being not having a house, right? And at the same time, and here's where the parting of the water comes up. People that are committing violent crimes are going to prison. They're just going to prison with a balance of how we send people. When you send somebody to prison, there's little value in sending a human being to prison for 100 years, right? There's just no value in that, right? Most of us are unlikely to last that long, much less if we're in our 40s. But what we do is we remove all possibilities of rehabilitation and redemption. And, if you look at a lot of the democracies around the world, generally 20 to 25 years of prison is a maximum term. And then after that, the only way you stay in prison is if medical and psychological officials determine that you're unfit because of your current state of mind and how dangerous you are to be released into the general population. We are an anomaly in terms of sending people to prison for as long as we do. And there's so much out there that shows that actually doesn't work. At the same time, when you take a 15 or 16-year-old and you send them to prison even for 30 years, right, which we have in the past, and you put them in an adult prison system, they still get out. They're still young and strong enough, and we have destroyed their life, and they come out with no hope, and they hurt themselves, and they continue to hurt others, and that's why we have such a high recidivism rate. Not to mention that so much of what the system has done is completely disproportionately impacting the Black community in ways that it wouldn't other communities for similar behavior.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I will just say I am okay with sending Ed Buck away for 100 years. That's one person that I will actually be okay with that happening.
I don't think he should ever get out of prison, right? And I agree with you, right? But the reality is, if you look at it from a strictly illogical point of view, this is a 63-year-old guy.
66.
66-year-old guy. Okay, the likelihood that he'll last more than 20 or 25 years in prison before, is unlikely, right? So it's that whole concept that we have that we we want to send this crazy sentence that really there's no connection to reality, but they are so costly in the terms of litigation and so much else. And I agree with you, by the way, there are people that should never come out, right? And certainly seeing what I've seen about Ed Buck lately, he should never come out. But, you can get there without necessarily creating a system that over criminalizes and over incarcerates such a large segment of our community.
So in that same vein, and I'm going to pause for a second to tell the 4 people who have their hands raised, drop your questions in the Q&A and we will get to them. Does that correlates directly to sentence enhancements, right?
Yep.
So, when someone, and I know this has been a huge issue for you since you've taken office, because you came in looking at what sentence enhancements mean and what they do to people who are convicted and are sent to prison. So for people who don't know what sentence enhancements are, can you explain that and then sort of talk about what you're doing with sentence enhancements under your administration?
Of course. So let me kind of give you a slight historical walkthrough because it's important to contextualize this. In California, up until the late 1980s, we really had no sentencing enhancements. We had our typical sentencing process, what we call a triad, where you have the middle sentence, the upper end, and the lower end, and every crime generally has the 3. And the judges and the prosecutors are generally going to stay in the middle unless they're aggravating circumstances, you go to the top, or mitigating, you go to the bottom. All of a sudden, we got into the war on crime and the war on drugs, and we started bringing enhancements. So 3 strikes, gang enhancements, gun enhancements came into the picture. California actually has over 100 enhancements. And those enhancements can take the base sentence of an individual, let's say 10, 15, 20 years, and they can very quickly multiply it, sometimes multiple decades, right? So all of a sudden, a 10 years prison sentence may become a 20 or a 30 or a 40-year prison sentence. And often, because of the way they're structured, they tend to visit heavily upon poor people, and in our communities, frankly, upon Black and brown people. So let me give you, for instance, a young Hispanic or a young African-American man or women grows up in a neighborhood where there are a lot of gang activity, right? They may have a relative that has been identified as a gang member. They may have a neighbor who has been identified as a gang member. When they walk out the front door, right, the kids that are hanging around, some will have pre-identified as a gang member. So he or she is associating with a family member, with their neighbors. Police comes by and they stop everybody. They're talking to everybody. They fill out what we call a field interview card. And now this young kid happens to be with another kid that has already pre-identified. So in a field interview card, they list him as an associate gang member. And that goes into a file system. And then let's say for another reason, you get stopped for a traffic stop or whatever weeks later, and now you are quote unquote an associate gang member, and you go into this file. And then one day you get accused of a crime, whatever it is. It could be, a lightweight crime or a heavier crime. All of a sudden, the prosecutor can bring that association with a gang, which you may or may not have been associated with a gang, by the way. And all of a sudden, you can end up with an enhancement that adds additional years to your terms of prison. What has been learned in this process in the last few years, number of things. Number one, the Cal gang system, where all this goes, has been proven to be full of erroneous information. They have found 3-year-old kids, and they have found people that are in the 80s that are gang members, quote unquote.
I might even be on that list.
You could very well be. I tell people that I grew up, if during my years as a young person, if those were been active, I would have probably been an associate because my neighbors were all involved potentially in gangs, right? So recently, as late this last year, I want to say March or so, there was a discovery that was published by the LA Times where there were young kids in the San Fernando Valley that were being falsely identified as gang members. And the way this came through is when the mother of one of them got notified that her son was being identified as a gang member, she challenged it, and that whole thing led, in fact, to a current prosecution about some LAPD officers. This is happening every day in our courtrooms throughout the state, and what it's doing is taking young Black and brown kids and multiplying the punitive approach or the punitive outcomes of the sentencing, often based on information that is extremely racist and sometimes, quite frankly, even false. So my approach to this is say, look, if you committed a crime and we can prove that you committed a crime, we're going to prosecute you and you will face the sentence that that crime calls for. But we're not going to continue to stack up more years because of the fact that where you grew up or sort of the environment that you have been for years, all of a sudden put you in a situation where you now have that tail that creates this additional liability for you. Let's take even gun enhancement. I know people think immediately, well, gun crime is going up, murders and all this stuff. And I tell people, look, if you commit a murder, the last problem you have to worry about is a gun enhancement. But on the other hand, you get stopped for some minor stuff, and all of a sudden you're found with a gun, and you're supposedly a gang member. So all of a sudden you're facing more consequences. And what this often fails to understand is that a lot of young people in certain neighborhoods, they feel, and I don't agree with it, but they feel that the only way they can protect themselves is by carrying a gun, right? I'm not saying that it's right. I am saying that it is the reality. But yeah, we don't spend any time going after the people that are making millions and billions of dollars selling guns and putting guns in our streets and trafficking on death in our communities. And that is what I see, a tremendous disproportionality. And at the end of the day, again, it continues to be the black and brown communities that get the brunt of this. And the people that are driving so much of this, that are making millions and millions of dollars, they get to walk away without any consequences.
Yeah. So I'm going to pull one question out of the Q&A. There's a question around the role of the district attorney's office as it relates to family court. And I'm not sure if there's a connection there, but the question is basically that, for decades, thousands of families, minority families, they've been torn apart in family court. And this person is asking what's being arranged to repair the broken family court system to assist families in staying together. And I myself am not really clear on what the role of the district attorney's office is with family court.
Yeah, I think if I understand the question correctly, and if not, please correct me, whoever asked the question. I think you're talking about dependency court, and that is an area that generally the prosecutors are not involved in. In LA County, usually you're going to have county council has a whole segment that deals in dependency court. And this really has to do with, violations of welfare institution codes, where supposedly maybe as a result of a complaint or investigation by the Department of Children and Family Services, they make an allegation that there's an unsafe condition at a home, and they separate kids from the family. And again, this is one of those areas where I think we over and over see the systemic racism across all of our systems, right? Not just the criminal legal system, but housing, dependency court, education, dare I say, health, right? I mean, we're looking at COVID right now. It's a perfect example of the inequality. So we know that many times we have seen Black families being broken apart through a system that doesn't understand sometimes the subtleties in how you could have a more effective intervention that keeps a family together and that works on the issues that that family perhaps needs help with, which at the end of the day, I believe, and I think many people today think the same thing, that trying to keep families together should be one of the goals of government. And sometimes that requires obviously interventions that may call for providing, trauma-informed services for parents and, some other interventions. But generally kids that are sent to foster care do not do very well. And we see that happening over and over again. Now, I get it, there may be cases where there's extreme danger and the separation is necessary. But I think often, especially when it comes to the Black community, we see those tools used much more rapidly and much more readily than they would be used in another community for similar behavior.
Wow.
Wait, the DA doesn't have a role there.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So in the vein of doing some educating during this conversation, I want to talk to you about the role of the district attorney and the city attorney's office, because there are a lot of people who think you are the city attorney.
Yeah.
And do not necessarily understand. So you will agree that homelessness in our unhoused community is probably #1 in terms of issues for a lot of people in LA County, right?
Yep.
But a lot of that falls under another attorney's purview. And as a progressive district attorney, how important is it to have a like-minded or like a progressive city attorney to work with? How are you currently working together with the city attorney's office around sort of the reforms that you're trying to do? I think it would be great for our audience to hear a little bit about that.
No, absolutely, and I'm glad that you bring that up, Jasmine, because tremendous amount of confusion. So let me begin by saying that there are 88 cities in LA County and plus the unincorporated areas. The city of LA, and I believe there are 9 other cities in the county, some of the largest ones, Long Beach, Santa Monica, Pasadena, and some in the South Bay area, they have their own city attorney.
Yes, Compton is one of those too.
Yeah,
Compton has
right.
its own city attorney.
And they have a city attorney Inglewood as well, actually. They have a city attorney that prosecutes misdemeanors. And in those cities where you have a city attorney that prosecutes misdemeanor, then there is a city attorney that will handle all those lower level offenses like,
Loitering, vagrancy,
trespassing, illegal camping, or however the ordinances in that particular jurisdiction. And the DA doesn't get to see those cases. Those cases are all handled at the city attorney level. The parts where there is not a city attorney with prosecuting powers, then the DA comes in and he does that. So we do play the role of a city attorney or a misdemeanor prosecutor in many other cities. But LA being the largest, it has a very robust, in fact, it has one of the largest city attorney's offices in the country. They have, I think they have an excess of 500-600 lawyers, and they prosecute all those misdemeanors. And frankly, it is extremely important that we work in unison so that when we're doing intervention programs, working, for instance, with the Office of Alternative to Incarceration, which I know, Jasmine, you work with many community members to create that. And we have Judge Armstead now doing great work trying to get this off the ground. And we have 10 sites actually around the county that we're working together with. Some of the sites are sites that I'm responsible for, but for instance, the sites in the city of LA or Long Beach or Santa Monica, they're handled by their city attorneys. And what we're trying to do is trying to be uniformity to the way that we approach this areas of concern. I don't want to use the term crime because it really are. I think it's a huge stretch to call it a crime. Is behavior that is being impacted by the social and economic conditions and sometimes the health conditions of people, and the criminal justice system or the criminal legal system is really inadequate to deal with this appropriately. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to create pre-filing diversion programs. But it's important to the point that you are making, Jasmine, that we all need to see the world through the same set of lenses. If we don't, then you begin to see a tremendous disproportionality in how people are treated, for instance, in the city of LA as opposed to other parts of the county. So having the same progressive approach to the work of not criminalizing poverty is critically important.
I think so too. Let's talk about juveniles, right? So there's been a lot of headlines over the past couple of weeks regarding young people in crime and some decisions that you have made. And but at the same time, for quite some time, there's been a push in our community to treat kids like kids, right? To not take a 15-year-old's life away behind a mistake. And as we just discussed, sentence enhancements, stacking up sentences and sending folks away for life to prison at the age of 15, 16, 17, or 18, even 19, 20, 21. So I know that was a big part of your platform when you ran. Can you talk about how that's going, what changes you've made, what you plan to make during your term, your first term as DA?
Yeah, and you know, this is one of the drivers of quite frankly the recall, right? Is that there are people that want to put children in adult prison, and I run on a very clear platform that I would not do so, and I'm not doing it. And we have already probably by now well over 100 kids that we have taken out of the adult prison track. Not to say they're not being held accountable. They are being held accountable, but they're being held accountable in the juvenile system. And here's why, because I think it's important to sort of understand why. Every single policy that I put into place was the result of working groups where we brought in national and local experts and community members to address issues. So juvenile justice was one of those. We brought some of the best brain on this area, both medical and legal, but we also brought community together. The reality is that unlike 20 or 30 years ago, we know now through the science that the human brain is not fully developed until we're in our mid-20s. And we know that there are many reasons, biological and chemical reasons for that. But to simplify this, um, basically, when we're very young, our impulse system and our risk-taking tolerance is very high. And it's generally contextualized to our environment. I tell people, if your parents are jumping out of airplanes, they're parachuters, at 15 years old, if they allow you to jump out of an airplane, you're probably going to be one of the bigger risk takers jumping out of an airplane. For kids that are born in communities where there's high level of trauma, high level of violence and poverty and disenfranchisement, the way they're going to express that risk is through the things that they have been exposed to, right? But here's where it's the difference between, quite frankly, people under 25 by and large, but certainly a 15, 16, 17-year-old, and someone that is 30, 40, 50 and above. We know now today through scientific, irrefutable evidence that the young brain can be very easily reprogrammed with the right level of care and intervention. So you can take a kid who has basically given up on life because of what he or she sees every day and does something really horrible, but with the right level of care and medical intervention, you can actually reprogram that young person's brain and bring it back to a place where they could be a productive member of our society. If we know that, if we know that that is what science is telling us, and yet we continue to insist blindly in sending kids to adult prison, throwing their life away, and by the way, again, you cannot escape race from this equation because they're not white kids from middle class that are going to the prisons. They're black and brown kids. And usually the path is they get arrested for low-level offenses like drug abuse drug use, or which, by the way, drug use in this country across the board, right? White kids use drugs as much as black kids, but the black kids get arrested, they build a criminal record, white kids don't. And then all of a sudden they do something a little more serious, they maybe get a little more punishment. Next thing you know, they have been institutionalized, and even before they get to be 18, they land in adult prison, right? And we destroy their life. And I refuse to do that because I believe that given what I know and given what we know today, it's unethical to do so.
I agree with you. It's so, I'm sitting here listening to everything. And again, I'm a middle of the road kind of person, but I think you can remember back when being DA or running for DA meant who was going to be the hardest on crime, right? Who was going to be, and now in 2021, thanks to the work of a lot of groups and a lot of individuals, that no longer is the case when it comes to district attorney. It is not who's going to be the toughest on crime. I think another huge issue that obviously is facing our community is how we deal with the mentally ill. It is something that falls under the city attorney's purview as well as the district attorney's purview, right? And so I know that that was also a huge part of your platform too. And you know, just to set the stage, folks, this is something that we talked about as a community, that we didn't want to see people who were suffering from mental illness thrown in prison with the key, you know, thrown away. We wanted to find a way to help these people, but also for the criminal justice system to recognize that they're not well. How's that going in your office? What have you done? What are you looking to do during your term around the prosecution of folks who are suffering from mental illness?
Yeah, no, and this is obviously one of the biggest challenges of our generation, right? We, as a nation, increasingly have had more people that are impacted by trauma and that are suffering from mental health problems. We defunded our mental health systems years ago, and we turn our jails and our prisons into the larger mental health institution. And LA County is probably the poster child for this. LA County has been dubbed to be the largest mental health institution in the country. And, when the jail has been on sort of their highest number of occupants, around 17,000, the Rand Corporation did a study about a year ago and concluded that nearly 50% of the people in our jail suffer from substantial mental health, and a large number of that from severe mental health problems. And by the way, most of them go in for very low-level offenses that are usually associated with poverty, right? Houselessness and you can't cure mental health with a concrete box anymore that you can cure cancer with a concrete box. So here's where the fruits of many probably in this room, but certainly I know Jasmyne, you were part of it, and others, the creation of ATI, the Alternatives to Incarceration, and ODR, the Office of Diversion and Reentry. We have beginning to have serious conversations about mental health diversion that the prior DA had the tools but didn't do. And we're actually engaging in those conversations and creating early diversion opportunities. And the 10 sites that I mentioned earlier that we're working with ATI is precisely when a police officer makes an arrest for some of this low-level offenses that are associated with mental health, houselessness, they make an original screening, make sure there is no violence or history of violence that could concern safety. And once they determine that's not the case, we have social workers that are placed there, paid by the county through nonprofit organizations and other organizations. They are deployed at the police station 24/7, and with the approval of the prosecutor, and we have created a whole list of basically what they can do without even calling us. Then they get turned over to the social worker who does a case assessment immediately at the station, 24/7, and they immediately do a warm handoff to other services. It may include, temporary housing and other services. And the real neat thing about this is that you begin to create a continuum of care. So we know that people that are mentally ill, they may get better for a while and then they go off again. And what we want to do is, rather than keep rotating them out of jail, once we create sort of that case history, then when they do come into our attention, they immediately pick up where they left off. And we know that often the road to recovery is not 1 or 2 trips to the police station, or maybe 5 or 6, but we do know that when there's continuum of care, you actually get people into a better place, and eventually they're not becoming a police problem or a problem for our community. So we now have 10 sites around the county where this work is happening, and the goal is eventually to go countywide as more resources from Measure J and more resources start coming in, quite frankly, from what we hope to see coming from the state and the federal government, that will be allocated to additional housing and services that will provide us an avenue to move away people from the criminal legal system into a more of a health-based approach to the work.
Yeah, and Measure J was something that the public supported. We wouldn't have Measure J if it had not been, again, just another reminder that LA County wants these reforms, right? Yeah. If we didn't want the reforms, we wouldn't support the ballot measures and the candidates who are running on that platform. So I want to switch gears just a little bit. I want to talk about the LGBTQ community and the DA's office. Yep. The big issue right now, obviously, is the murders of trans men and women. And I know your office takes that seriously, but I just wanted to just raise that and just see if you had any thoughts on it, what your office is doing around that. And also in terms of, and we have a question, actually, I could tie this in from one of our board members. You know, I'll tie this all together. Survivors, right? Survivors of crimes, and also survivor families. And Sandy Cook, who's on our board, she's wondering, you know, if our district attorney's office, are we doing enough to educate the public also about all of these reforms? She has a two-part question. I have the thing about the trans, I'm throwing this all at you. I have the LGBTQ trans murders issue. And we want to talk about survivors families, and are we doing enough to educate the public about all of these reforms? Okay, it's all yours.
All right, so let me begin actually with the last one, because that's the easiest one. Are we doing enough? We're not. Okay, we have a long road to go. You know, there was a poll that was conducted by Brender and Associates LA County about, I want to say about 4 months ago now, and it was the victims of violent crime, right? And it was across the county, and 60% of those people said two very clear messages. Number one, that they felt that my office did not provide enough trauma-informed care. And I agree with them. And one of the problems that we have is our victim services unit is one of the lowest paid. The entry-level requirements are very low. So while we have very dedicated men and women working in this unit and they learn on the job, this is not a place where you should be learning on the job, right? We need to up the requirements. We need to up the pay so that we can keep people there and begin to look at a trauma-informed system of care for our victims. The other thing that about 60%, by the way, said is that they were interested in rehabilitation and redemption. They were not necessarily caught up on an eye for an eye that we often see, the larger conversation, but they wanted accountability. They wanted to make sure that whoever did the harm, that they are held accountable. But they also wanted to see an off-ramp at some point for those people. So we call it, I'm sorry?
In that restorative justice vein.
Absolutely. Yeah. So absolutely, we're not doing enough. We are in conversations with the board of supervisors, and we're looking to this. And by the way, to that end, we have the first in the country that I believe to be the Victims Advisory Board, which is composed mostly of men and women of color, that they themselves or their family members have been victims of serious crimes, including murder, some of them by police, some of them by community violence. And they're very aggressive about ensuring that we bring about serious reform to that work. Now I'm going to move to the first part of your question, the issue of hate against trans and the assaults that we have seen. And this is absolutely an area that I take very, very seriously. But here's the direction also that we want to bring to the table. By the time there is the assault, or by the time that there is serious harm, obviously the vehicle for accountability is the trial and punishment. But what we're trying to do also is we're trying to bring, through community partnerships, how do we deal with those really early low-level signs of hate and bring in restorative justice to this. So when you see the sort of the homophobic behavior, or quite frankly, the anti-Black behavior, whatever. By the way, people, I know that the Asian community has been targeted horribly in the last few years, but we forget that the African-American community continues to be the #1 recipient of hate crimes in this community and this country, right? And often we don't talk about that stuff, right? But the numbers are irrefutable that the first community that gets the most hate is the Black community. And then, you know, there's combination, the Asian community, Jewish community, LGBT community, generally the trans community within that community. So we need to do multiple things. We need to, yes, we need to be aggressive when the serious crimes occur and make sure accountability takes place. But we also need to think about prevention and restoration early on so that we reduce the number of crimes that occur. And that is also an area we're engaged in. We just recently applied for a grant actually to work with community-based organizations to have this early intervention opportunity. Because again, much like when we're talking about dealing with adolescent grade behavior, there's strong evidence that when you deal with early reflections of hate towards any one group, which generally happen when you're younger, a good intervention at those early stages actually can, in fact, turn around the way that people perceive others and have a positive impact. I tell you another area, though, where the trans community and the Black and brown communities also get heavily impacted, and I'm doing a lot of work around this, is singling out people in prostitution enforcement, right? And we criminalize a lot of young Black women and brown women and a lot of trans women, sometimes for survivor behavior. And in the past, that has been sort of tied along we're going after human trafficking, but interestingly enough, the traffickers are not the ones that are going to jail. It's the young women or the trans women that is being picked up. And we have come to a place now where we're not prosecuting those cases. I'm talking about not the trafficker, but the workers, and we're bringing different levels of intervention instead of criminalizing this group. So I know I threw a lot at you, and a lot of this is obviously a work in progress, especially how to deal with survivors. But we're pushing all the buttons.
Yeah. So a couple of things come to mind before we move on. I found it really interesting during voir dire for the Ed Buck trial. One of the questions asked of the prospective jurors was how they felt about sex work. Sex workers, sex work. And it was very interesting that out of the 50 prospective jurors, the majority of them wanted to decriminalize sex work.
Decriminalize or criminalize?
Decriminalize.
Yeah, right. I agree. That's definitely what we see in society.
And I was amazed sitting there because it said to me, okay, this is a random selection of people from LA County, and all these people feel this way, right? And then I think I would be remiss if I just didn't put this out there. I love everything you said about dealing how we deal with survival sex workers and also the LGBTQ community, because both of those issues were part of the Ed Buck trial, right? His victims were sex workers, and they were Black gay men, right?
Yep.
So I know in the future, if we have any more Ed Bucks in LA County, you're gonna prosecute them.
Well, and if you guys know, we need to have conversations, right? Because the other thing, and if you recall, Jasmine, and I'm glad that you said that at the very beginning, I run on a platform that was very clear, and I'm living up to that platform, right? And part of the platform was also an open door to their community, and we're doing that, and we're having conversations, but that is a journey. When there are problems, we need to have those conversations, and certainly you and others have as much access as anybody else to come to me and to come to my office.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I mean, just in the short time that you've been in office, you've been more accessible than our previous DA was for 8 years. So I appreciate that. One of our other board members asked a question. I don't know if you're going to be able to answer it, but I want to be respectful and ask the question. It is from, okay, my computer's acting stupid. Hold on. It's from our board member, and you probably know her, Miss Jimmy Woods Graves.
Mm-hmm.
He was asking specifically about an incident involving a firefighter, I believe, slapping a patient, and wanting to know if that case was going to be prosecuted. Firefighter who slapped a patient who was handcuffed and gagged. The case was sent to the DA's office more than 6 years ago. Now, I can imagine the reason why this is important to Miss Jimmy Woods Gray is because she sits on the fire commission.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But I don't know if you can talk about it, but I have a respect.
I'm assuming that this is a case in the Valley, in the Van Nuys area. And if I'm not, then you can correct me. If it is the case that it's being looked at, certainly the evidence will be evaluated with an eye towards accountability where it can be. Obviously, I can't get into any details. If I have the wrong case, please reach out to me separately, and we'll tell you as much as we can in terms of where we are.
So we have like about 8 minutes left, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time, just sort of talking about this possible recall and what the community can do to be helpful. And the reason why I think it's important is because you beat Jackie Lacey by over 250,000 votes, which says that the voters in LA County wanted to see change in the district attorney's office. If they didn't, they would have reelected the person who had been in the office. And the idea that a group of folks are going to come along and snatch that change away is absolutely ludicrous. And so obviously we're facing a recall with our governor. And, here locally, you've been our first guest, but we're also going to be speaking to Councilmember Mike Bonin as well to talk about his issues. But what is it, LAAAWPAC, we're Black women who are engaged in politics. We sit on commissions, we do all kinds of stuff. We're very active. We're elected. We're involved in the Democratic Party. So we are very engaged. And this is going to be very important to our community. If they should succeed in being able to trigger a recall election.
Yeah, first of all, we are going to fight really hard to try to avoid the recall election, right? Because if we get there, then, the county is going to spend $70–80 million to run a special election, and obviously it will be a lot of money involved. It's important, and I said this at the very beginning, to look at who's behind this. This is very heavily Trump, very heavily Republican money behind this, police money, as well as heavy duty donors in the Republican Party. You have probably heard about a number of cities, about 19 cities throughout the county that have done votes of no confidence. And in almost all of them, you can see the traces to police presence, either as a member of the city council, the mayor, a family member, or you have in some areas that are policed by the sheriff department, where the sheriff has made it a mission in life to be part of this recall, to divert attention from his own failures.
Yes.
Yeah. So the money and the sort of the impetus is coming from that quarter. People that frankly were heavily opposed to my message during the election, and they immediately wanted to undo the election. In fact, it was so rapid that the week that I was sworn in, we got information that went to the county registers, tried to begin a recall process, and the county registrar had to tell them, well, you got to wait 90 days. So much for my policies. It really was from day one. These are not people that are interested, by the way, in safety. This is really about incarceration and punishment. You have to understand what's behind it. This is really about money and political influence. In this country, and certainly in our community, in the last 30 or 40 years, as we sort of went to war with our community, especially our Black and brown community, we created an industry around this, right? We built in California 22 prisons and 1 public university. Those prisons become a major economic driver, right? Not only building the prison, but staffing the prison, supporting the prison. We have an industry like bail bonds people. We have, we have the whole machinery behind police unions, right? The growth of police departments, prosecutors, prisons. That created a huge economic incentive and consequently a lot of political power, right? For years, these groups are defined who is good in public safety, who is not. And if they target you for being soft on crime, generally you either got thrown out of office or you never got elected. But when you look and you sort of start peeling the onion, it's really about economic and political power. And that's what's driving this recall. These are people that want to make sure that we continue to send Black and brown kids to adult prison. Why? Because that's the feeder pool to keep those prisons open, right? These are the people that want to make sure that we have this very extensive prison terms because it keeps the machine going. These are the people that want to make sure that you're going to be held in jail unless you can post bail because you want the bail industry to get a piece of the action, which, by the way, in the Black and brown community usually means grandma takes a second trust deed on their home. Yeah. And even if the person gets released, then they have all kinds of problems, right? I can go on and on, but I think you get the picture. But how can you support? How can you learn more? We have a website. It's called standwithgascon.org, and I really encourage you to go in and take a look. By the way, this is people power. You know, we have Local 2015, you know, which is the largest union in the state. And, you know, you have April who runs that union, very strong Black women. We got Holly Mitchell supporting. We have a whole bunch of people supporting this because they recognize that this is not only a fight for democracy. And I said a fight for democracy because think about it for a moment. An election occurred less than a year ago. As you mentioned, over 250,000 people voted for me over the other person. And immediately, the people that were against me getting elected decided that the path is a path of a recall, which, by the way, you have to understand in California politics, the Republican is not going to get elected countywide in LA. They can get their 5th district, but they're not going to get county elected. The only way they can do it, much like Schwarzenegger became governor years ago with 31% of the vote, is you throw a recall, you get enough people not to see what the truth is, they vote yes for recall, and then the next step is, well, now you got a list of characters here, 20, 30, 40 people, and you pick one, you can have somebody with even as low 10, 15% getting elected. When you look at the signature gathering in this recall, most of it is happening in gun shops, bail bonds offices, in some of these communities where you have the strong pro-Trump and very Republican presence. And when you see what the signature gatherers are asking people, when they ask them is, do you believe that we support or we should support victims' rights? And of course, who's going to say no? And then as soon as the person says yes, they, well, will you please sign here? That's the way they're collecting signatures. So what can you do? Well, we need to fight this together. I got elected because of you. Quite frankly, many of you voted for me, supported me. Others have come along later. If you believe in what I'm standing for, what I'm doing, I encourage you to go to that website, you know, standwithgascon.org. Look, get yourself educated. And
in the chat for you. So
I will put it in the chat as we're speaking. Okay.
It's there. So people just go to it and to sign up to get information.
Yep, you can do all of that. And of course, I know that we have Jamar Hayner is here with us too, and she is the brain behind all this operation. Yes. And she will be available to all of you as well.
Well, I appreciate you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. We had a couple of trolls, but you know, it was. I think it was a great conversation. We were able to get through and have a substantive conversation about the issues. And you are the DA for the largest county in the country with the largest district attorney's office. So for you to give us 60 minutes of your time, you know, as LAAAWPAC, we appreciate you and invite you to come back. But just thank you for doing that. Thank you.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. Thank you so much, Jasmyne.
Thank you. And for everybody else, LAAAWPAC.org, sign up, get involved. On August 9th, we'll be hosting a conversation with LA Council member Mike Bonin. And that's it. All right. Thank you, everyone.